Hey guys, great to see you. Welcome back to another video. So today we're going to take a look at the death grip, which is when we press far too hard with our fretting hand down on the fingerboard. And it's quite an innocent mistake to make. We've all done it at some stage or other. So in this video, what I'd like to show you is why it happens and what we can do about it. So generally speaking, this situation will come about in a number of situations. So starting off with when we're playing bar chords, for example, that's a very, very common example of when we might encounter the death grip. It's less likely to come about when we're playing single note and melodic type of material, and far more likely when we're playing chordal based stuff. Like I say, bar chords are a prime example of this, and it can happen when we're static, so i.e. just playing one bar chord, or it can also happen when we're transitioning between chords, in other words, moving from one chord to another, and typically one bar chord to another bar chord. So there's some of the reasons why it happens, and of course there are more, right? But they're the common ones, and what I'd like to do is to give you some information and help as to how you can best avoid falling into this trap. Because with a few simple ideas, you're going to find that you can overcome this if it's something that you find yourself doing from time to time. And like I say, it's quite an innocent mistake to make. We all make it at some stage when we're learning guitar. Say, for example, we're playing a bar chord. Let's just take a G major bar chord, right? Keep things simple. Generally, the latter part of the chord, so this position we put in front of the index finger, is rarely problematic. The problems arise with the barring finger. And what will happen is we'll try to play this chord, especially when we're starting out, right? And we might get something like this. So some of the strings are sounding and others are sounding muffled or just not sounding at all. So our natural reaction to this problem is to strangle the living daylights out of the guitar and go, press down as hard as you can so they all sound. That is the mistake. We never want to fall into that trap. When we're learning to play bar chords, there's a certain amount of natural tension and symptoms that we might encounter when we're learning bar chords, which are perfectly acceptable. So our hands might ache a little bit, our fingers might be sore a little bit, our wrists might be sore, and that's all kind of acceptable in a sense. It's understandable if it's something we're doing for the first time and we haven't really done much of it. But the death grip is a completely different ball game. This is where we can really hurt our hands and our wrists and everything else if we're not too careful. So the way we're going to deal with this with our G major bar chord, and in fact any bar chord that you go on to play, we need to focus on this index finger, which is the finger which is doing the barring. And the way that we should approach our bar chords are to start out by clearly not pressing hard enough. It's far better to go about it that way than it is to press too hard and then reduce tension. I always think it's far, far better if you start out like this. All the strings, none of them sound. Then we apply a little bit of pressure, a tiny bit of pressure. Some of them start to sound. A little bit more pressure. Even more start to sound. And then till we reach the point where we apply just enough pressure. And there's this little pinch that we use that must be delicate. It should never be strangling the living daylights out of it, okay? So we're just looking for a nice, gentle pressure. So start out not pressing hard enough and then build up to the point whereby you're pressing just hard enough. Now another thing that you want to do is be very mindful about your playing. Very often we don't have the time to think about how hard we're pressing because we're thinking of too many other things, right? If we're learning a song, we're trying to figure out where the chords all fall, how long we play them for, how soft or how hard we might play them, whether we're playing with our fingers or with the plectrum. How hard we press is the last thing we're thinking about. But I'd like that to be one of the first things that you think about. That's going to make a tremendous difference to your playing. So perhaps what you can do is when you're starting out and you practice, I always suggest it's a good idea to have a warm-up before you start your kind of playing and trying to learn whatever it is that you're learning. Just try and loosen up with some exercises. It could be scales. They're always a good idea because they get your fingers moving individually. And then you can do some bar chord practice like we're running through now. And then that way your hands are just going to be perfectly primed for what you're going to do. So be mindful of what they're doing. Always ask yourself the question, am I pressing too hard? And then that way, what you're going to find is you start adjusting and finding that perfect balance. Now, another situation where the death grip comes into play is when we're transitioning, say, between chords like this. Some people, when they're doing this type of thing, don't realize that we should release the tension between the transitions. So in other words, what happens is some people will go and they'll keep the pressure on whilst they're moving from one chord to another like this. Well, that's a surefire recipe for injuring your hands and your wrists and just coming away from your guitar playing feeling very sore. The correct way of transitioning between bar chords, and these could be major, they could be minor, they could be seventh, suspended, it doesn't really matter what type of bar chord. It applies to all of the different shapes. What we're looking to do, if you remember our earlier example, is find the correct pressure and play the chord. At this point, when we're going to transition, we release, and it's important to note we release. We don't take our fingers off and lose the position, because that's going to slow us down. For example, if we were to play the chord, take off our fingers like so, and then try and go to another chord, there's far more to do than we need to do, right? Far better to press, play the chord, release, move to the new position, press, release, move to the new position, press, like so. And like I say, if you can incorporate some of this into your practice, it's going to go a long way. And what we can do for a little practice session is just go, might go to the major positions, then to the minor positions. And just see how lightly we can travel up and down. And then that way, you're putting your attention firmly on the important things that need to be thought about, i.e. how much pressure we should be applying. Now, there are other things that we can do to help ourselves, okay? For example, you don't want to be playing with very heavy strings, and very often it helps to play with extra light strings in many ways. Not just what we're talking about here, but for example, just when you're playing standard open chords and things like that, you can play extra light strings far longer than you can play, say, medium gauge strings or something like that. So the gauge of string that you use is going to have an impact on these things as well, and it's well worth taking into account. What I find is the quality of the tone can drop off slightly with the lighter you go with the strings. But the flip side of that is that you can play longer and you don't get quite as sore. You don't have to press quite as hard and all these other elements. So it's kind of like a balance, right? Now, the other very important factor about this situation with the death grip and things like that, like I've said to you, that when we try and play a bar chord and we get this kind of thing happening, that tendency is to just strangle the living daylights out of it, like I say. But you see, very, very often the problem isn't the pressure, it's the positioning. So let me explain what I mean. Our fingers aren't straight like a ruler, right? Or a straight edge. They are full of little hollows and kind of where the knuckles are, and they're just not entirely straight. Now, the important thing to realize is finding the optimal position for your index finger. And by that, what I mean is, let me start out by having the tip of my finger very, very close to the top string, like so. Now, obviously, because I've been doing this for many, many years, I can move this index finger in any position and get the strings to sound how I want them to. However, when you're starting out, just moving your finger up a millimeter can make all the difference. So what I'd like you to do is to, rather than think about pressure and how hard you press, try moving this index finger up and down, because look, we can go right from there to here. Now that is a lot of travel, and very, very often what you'll find is if your finger's in the wrong position, it doesn't matter how much you press, you still get this dead string sound somewhere. Whereas when you start moving and experimenting with this up-down position, as it were, with the index finger, it's like magic. You suddenly come across the perfect placement for your index finger, and suddenly, you know, playing bar chords is not so problematic. So that's something that which is very, very often overlooked. So hopefully with some of these little pointers that we've taken a look at in this lesson, it will help you avoid this kind of, you know, squeezing everything to death, because that's sure to impair you and slow you down and hinder you and work against you in the long run. So it's these simple things that we want to get right at the beginning of our journey. So I really do hope that that's helped you in some small way. And please do share your feedback with me. It could be that after a few weeks of implementing some of these ideas that you notice a real difference. And if you could share that with the community here, that could be very useful to other people as well. So I'm very interested in your own experiences as well. Always share those. And I look forward to seeing you soon with another lesson. And in the meantime, you take care.